Hi, this is Kendra. I'm one of the founders of Strong Family Alliance, and I'm here today interviewing BT Harman. I'm going to tell you more about him in a second. We're going to be talking today about bridging the gap between Christian parents and their LGBTQ kids. And as I mentioned, I'm one of the founders of Strong Family Alliance. Today, we are celebrating National Parent Coming Out Day, which is a day where parents can show support of their out kids. And I'm really grateful to have BT Harman with me. I have been a fan of his for a long time. Like many others, I became a fan of his through Jen Hatmaker and her, I think was it a tweet about you, BT?
I think it was maybe a tweet and a Facebook post, and
She got it around, I feel like. And so she posted about it, and I walk a lot, so I was walking, and every day that was my walking soundtrack was your post. And I laughed, I cried, I had every emotion. I basically, for those of you who don't know BT, he has a podcast and a written word that was turned into a podcast called Blue Babies Pink. And I am going to it's about growing up gay in the Christian South. And I just kind of want to get all to the point here. I'm going to just get right to it and say, when I heard his podcast, my number one emotion was, I wish everyone in the universe could hear this podcast. I particularly wish people could hear it that have trouble understanding, because maybe they haven't, quote unquote, known anyone who's gone through it, or maybe they're a parent and they have a kid going through it and they're struggling to understand. I think it's just something that I wish everyone could listen to. And so I want to do my part. I feel very compelled to do my part to get the word out about it. And I always do what Jen Hatmaker says. I mean, I think it's pretty good, motto in life, right? Do what she says. So because I could talk to you for 10 hours, and unfortunately we don't have that much time, I just want to encourage people to go, if you do one thing, go listen to the podcast or read it on bluebabiespink.com. We'll share that URL later. But also, there's one episode, episode 29, which is, there's a lot that's been done with that episode, because it definitely resonated with people. It definitely resonated with me. I listened to it again yesterday and bawled my eyes out again. I mean, it's just really good. I'd kind of forgotten about the beginning part, and man, it takes you through some emotions, but I really love it. So there is a new iteration I want to mention of Blue Babies Pink. I'm going to let BT tell you about that shortly. But I also want to mention that BT's day job is as a writer, a strategist, a speaker. He lives in the cool, he says historic, but cool and hip part of Atlanta called Cabbagetown. So welcome, BT, to National Parent Coming Out Day. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thanks, Kendra. I appreciate it. It's good to be on here. I love what you guys are doing through Strong Family Alliance.
I appreciate that. We're pretty happy about it. I just want to mention real quick before I ask a question that Strong Family Alliance is really about hitting parents where they are and helping them where they are. And I cannot wait to hear what you're doing in that arena. I want to tell you that as a mom, that's my connection, is I really want to help other moms struggling in any way. And this is one way I've seen some struggle through personal friends and family and so forth. And so I know that's what you do too. And I want to just say that there aren't a ton in my mind of LGBTQ people that are working with parents. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of the parents are the people that have hurt, they're hurt, by parents. And so they don't have a lot of grace. And I just want to say that I love the grace you have for that. So tell me just a little bit, I know a little about your background, but tell me just a little bit about your background and how you came to the Blue Babies Pink podcast.
Thanks, Kendra. So my name is BT. I'm 37 years old. I live in Atlanta. But grew up in Alabama, so I'm a Bama boy at heart, a little bitty town called Florence of about maybe 50-ish thousand people. And I was the son of a Southern Baptist pastor, Brother Bill Trapp, as he was called. I was the youngest of three boys, so just grew up in an incredible family, very loved, nurtured, cared for, grew up in the church, had a great experience growing up in the church. I became a Christian when I was about 14 at a revival in Pensacola, Florida. Came back, my youth pastor began to sort of mentor me, got really involved in our youth group, was sort of a leader in the youth group, went to a small Christian high school, played basketball, played football, was, the president of all these various student organizations, and really just, again, had a great experience at my Christian high school as well. I went to college. My dad was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease when I was about 16 or 17. Went to college locally to sort of stay home with him, but got involved with campus ministries at college, did the fraternity thing, was president of my fraternity, and graduated in 2005, jumped on board with a startup in Birmingham, Alabama. And that was really when I began to, sort of finally accept that I was what I called back then same-sex attracted, more commonly referred to as gay, but I did not use that word back then because I didn't.
I'm sure you did. No, sure. I was like, we don't want to say that word, just, not
yet. Baptist preachers' kids in Alabama are, traditionally not supposed to be gay. So that's not how the script typically goes. But I really had just been sensing that and knew I was not really into girls, but just refused to accept that because that was so foreign to me, so bizarre, so out there. I didn't know any gay people. This was the early 2000s when it was even way less accepted than it is now. And so began working my career about the age of 23 and just threw myself into work and really kind of became a workaholic as really my chief primary coping mechanism. Because at this point, Kendra, because I was a follower of Christ, I didn't think there was any okay way to be gay, so I kind of committed to just being single and celibate. That was the path that I felt like God was calling me to, really the only acceptable and okay path, only way to honor him. So I just began to sort of plow through my 20s, hiding the secret, not telling anyone, not dating, just work, and hope that it all kind of works out. And so really when I got to my late 20s, that plan began to sort of unravel. I did eventually come out to sort of my closest friends and have that conversation, which was really cathartic for me just to have somebody in my life I could talk about that with in my late 20s. But then as time progressed, even that, having that community, having those confidants, even that sort of began to break down. And I began to deal with some very serious anxiety. Had 2 trips to the hospital with anxiety-related stuff, basically, which for me, this was all new because I had always had my act together, had always been the person everyone was looking to for leadership and for confidence and for management, in a business context. And so that was when I first began to let myself sort of question, like, Brett, you've always, attempted to follow God in everything you do. And when you've made that choice, it's always led to increasing levels of freedom, of joy, of what I would call, flourishing. But in this one particular area, the more I followed this path that I thought God wanted me to follow, the darker life got. And despite all my attempts to stay healthy and to stay happy, I was really going down a really, progressively darker path. And so I really began to allow myself, eventually around the age of 30-ish, I began to date. I said, all right, I'm going to try this thing and see how it works out. And dating was initially terrible until it wasn't, until I found a great person. And I am now married to a man. My husband's name is Brett, which is my initial and original name was Brett Trout. I now go by BT Harlan. I took his last name. And then to go back, to bring this thing full circle, I launched a blog and podcast in 2016 and 17 called Blue Babies Pink, which is what you referenced earlier. Thank you for those kind words, by the way. And really just wanted to tell my story to anyone that wanted to read it and just say, hey, I don't care where you stand on this issue, if you're conservative, if you're progressive, if you're Christian, if you're not. But if you want to follow my story, sort of going back to childhood, and I'm going to tell you everything, about how that whole thing unraveled and unfolded, because I had actually been keeping notes for about a decade on that experience. So that's a really long story made really, really short.
Yeah, like I said, you guys got to read the pod and listen to it, or I like to listen to it. I like Brett's voice and telling it. It's very personal. And I think that there's just so much more to it that we just can't even go into. But the whole history was, just really heart-wrenching, but it's so great to have a happy ending. I'm glad you went and skipped to the end and said, okay, but now everything's good. This is something I feel like a lot of LGBTQ people have, is this sort of trajectory, a happy childhood, maybe, hopefully happy, and then this, real struggle, and then they come out, and I hope they come out. The reason we exist is to try to help them come out of that in a healthy way. And, kids that are LGBTQ are 8 times more likely to commit suicide, and almost every other anxiety. You're just not alone. Anxiety, depression, and all the things that come with not being yourself. I feel like that's one thing that we're really trying to help. So this is again why I think the podcast is so helpful. So, but Strong Family Alliance exists for parents, and so I want to talk a little bit about parents. You talked about coming out to your A team, and I think, is that true? A lot of people do that before maybe their parents. They come out to people that are maybe a little bit less emotionally invested.
Yeah, I've often said, I kept a list in my mind of like, who are the most trustworthy people in my life? Because this was a massive secret that I guarded very closely.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it was like, I could not tell someone that was 99% trustworthy, like it had to be 100%. And so yeah, I've called this the A-team, meaning like, who are the people that if and when you come out to them, they're not going to leave. They're not going to walk out the door. They're not going to abandon you. And so I am an advocate for those who are thinking about coming out, regardless of age. Once you get to that point, I would recommend coming out to those people who have your back no matter what, because there may be people who don't have your back, maybe people who walk out. And when that happens, you've got to have someone to run to. So that's always, my first bit of advice for anyone thinking about coming out is make your list of the people that you feel really confident will still be there.
And as a mom, and I have a son, I have a 9-year-old, and I always think though about like, it's kind of heart-wrenching to think that he wouldn't be able to tell me something that was so big, but I get it. It's so hard for all parties, but I just am curious. I need you to tell me, and like I said, it's episode 29, but tell me a little bit about what it was like when you came out to your family. How did they react? How did you feel about it?
Yeah. So it was quite the day. It's August 21st, 2011. My dad was deceased. And so I actually drove to Louisville, Kentucky, where my mom lives, and just showed up on her doorstep unannounced. Again, I was 29 years old and was just absolutely scared to death, to be honest, because my mom is a Christian person. She's fairly conservative. And I really didn't fear that my mom was going to, kick me out of the family or, get violent. I never thought that she would do that. But it is just the fear of how is she going to react? Is she expecting this? Is she not? Is this going to forever change our relationship? It does, side note. And so, so it was a very scary moment. And I had to just psych myself up for weeks, to actually have this conversation happen. And so showed up, knocked on her door. She was surprised. I walked right inside, grabbed a chair out of the kitchen, put it in the middle of her living room and just said, Mom, I need to tell you something. It's that I struggle with same-sex attraction. That was the phrase. That was how I phrased it back then. And, she just had this look of shock, of bewilderment. She really did not say a whole lot. To her credit, what she did say was fairly positive in that she told me she loved me, that would never change. But for us, it got really dicey in the weeks after. And that's when, she went through a very, very difficult season of questioning herself. I work with parents now of LGBT kids a lot. So I've asked them this question: what was it like when you had that conversation? And, parents often, they actually use the language of trauma. For those who are blindsided by it, they often will remember what their child was wearing. They'll remember, something, they had eaten that day for lunch or whatever. And so, it's really hard. I've also said that I think parents go through the stages of grief. Many of them do. My mom certainly did. I could track it. I've got emails, you've got to track all the different stages unfolding. And so, it's really, really hard. And listen, I do think the focus in this coming out conversation should be on the child, should be on the LGBT person, because again, this is potentially the toughest day of their life, but we can't forget and neglect the parents, because their emotions matter as well. And their response is a really, really big deal. And so this is why I'm very passionate about this.
Well, and that's what we say, a strong family. I think the number one determinant of the outcome of the health of the child, whatever you believe, is the parental response. And if a parent, God forbid, kicks their kid out, so to speak, or metaphorically kicks their kid out in their life, just all of those risk factors go up so drastically. And for me, that is just so heart-wrenching, because it's kind of it gets better thing for parents. It does get better. Tell me about, I want to switch gears for a second and talk about, so you told me your mom did all right, little dicey after, but tell me about, just give me a little glimpse into just when you talk to LGBTQ kids and you talk to the parents, what's your ideal response that a parent would have? I mean, what would be, I always think do no harm, right? I mean, try to not say things that you might regret later, because those are just really, those probably are etched in the mind of the child as well, or the kid, the person as well. Tell me a little bit about lifeboats and what which parents would know.
Yeah, so you mentioned lifeboats, which is episode 29 from Blue Babies Pink. You could go to bluebabiespink.com and read it if you're watching this. But yeah, that was a story. Again, I told the story of coming out to my mom, driving to Kentucky, the whole thing. And then as I was writing that episode, I had this sense that there was something else out there for this message. And It just sort of appeared in my mind, almost by, an act of divinity potentially, but yeah, just this image of a lifeboat. And really my experience for all those years living this story alone, struggling with all of the internal turmoil, it was as if I was on a lifeboat out at sea, no paddle, no water, no map, just sort of being battered around. And then one day I get washed ashore and I walk up, to my mom's house and have that conversation. And so yeah, I just created that metaphor, that little story, called it Lifeboats. I've since turned it into a little short film of about 5 minutes long. So it's sort of a monologue where I'm telling that. But yeah, to answer your question about, what is the ideal response? I mean, obviously, do no harm is a really great basic principle. I'm an advocate for short coming out conversations. Oftentimes they're not that way. They drag on, they get extremely emotional. They become very theological. And I just am a very firm believer that is not the time to talk about particularly theology, beliefs. That time will come. Parents will have their chance to talk about maybe the moral aspects of being gay or gay behavior, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I think just try not to do any injury, and then obviously reaffirm your love for your child as strongly and repetitively as you can. One of the lies that I believe, Kendra, growing up was that those who really knew me, if someone got to really know me, they would cease to love me. I had so much shame around this particular issue that's why I kept it hidden, because I thought if I reveal this part of me, everyone will walk away. Potentially even my mom, potentially, sibling, whoever it may be. And so, it was so sweet to have that conversation with different people, friends, other family members. And when they cut me off early on and say, hey, just so you know, Brett, this doesn't change anything. I still love you and I always will. So I just want to establish that. So kind of building that foundation initially is very, very important.
I think it's interesting. I think the thing about the lifeboat is you say, ask them if they're hungry. Ask them if they ever saw God. Ask them if they, please don't tell them that God hates people in lifeboats or, just this whole metaphor was so interesting. It really brought to mind the fact that often for the parent, this is such a shock. And then, this is something the kid's been going through or adult has been going through for so many years. And so there's this disconnect, right, between, what you want the reaction to be based on how many years you've toiled over this and been in kind of a, having a hard situation. And then the parent's shock, right? And that's part of what causes it.
That's it. And to be honest, I mentioned the stages of grief earlier. The most commonly recurring stage of grief that has, I think, the most negative effect is denial. And so oftentimes a child will come out and then a parent will go into that denial season, and that can last for weeks, months, or years, where they just refuse to talk about it. They don't want to bring it up. They don't know how to bring it up. It's awkward because this is something that a lot of parents did not wish for their child. This is sort of the death of some dreams, right? I pictured my child being married to someone of the opposite sex, and there's a wedding, and then there's grandkids. And so this is devastating to that idealized version of the future. But again, I always say, this is something you're not going to change. Attempting to send your child to counseling is, to get this fixed is probably the worst. I wouldn't say probably, it definitely is the worst response. And so really part of this journey for parents is just accepting this as a reality. Now, again, where we go with it is another conversation, but the first step is to accept that this is real. If your child is older, this is very, very likely not to change. Potentially if they're younger, they're still kind of questioning and figuring it out. Maybe there's a season of kind of waiting to see where they land on the spectrum, so to speak. But if they're older, beyond the age of 18, they have a pretty good sense of who they're attracted to. So just trying to avoid that denial phase and bringing it up, having the courage as a parent to have that conversation and to ask your child their story. I mean, this is one of the most simple and powerful things a parent can do, is just to say, hey, Brett, if you're talking to me and you're my mom, hey, tell me your story about what has this been like growing up, keeping this secret. And your child may not want to talk about it, but I suspect they probably will, if not initially, then eventually. And that's really, really healing as well for the parent to just engage with that story and all the ups and downs that come along with it.
So I think we're kind of establishing that parents need the support too, in order to support their child. You're right, it's all about the person that's going through it, but the parents, needing the support. And I think part of Strong Family Alliance also is it's online, it's sort of anonymous. We're trying to reach people in rural areas maybe that just can't go to a chapter meeting, or maybe they're afraid to go to their pastor, things like that. And so we provide information online, and I know you're doing some really great stuff that I'm a huge fan of as well. Can you just talk a little bit about the support that you're offering for parents that's online, anonymous, meeting them where they are? I guess anonymous. Is it anonymous or?
It can be. I'll say that. Yeah, I can definitely describe that. So yeah, back to your point, I've talked to a lot of parents. I've actually done surveys with parents. The top two emotions that parents experience when their child comes out are worry and anxiety. Those are the two emotions that sort of take over in that initial moment. And then the other thing parents tell me is that they feel very alone in this journey as the parent of a gay child. Kendra, you probably know this. Statistically, about 3 to 5% of the human population falls on the LGBT spectrum. It's a very, very small amount, where there's not many of us out there, statistically speaking. And so if you're a parent of an LGBT child, you probably don't have another friend in that same boat. You probably don't have Susan down the street who you can confide in. And so what happens is parents pull in. They get very inward focused. If you're a person of faith, there's a high likelihood you don't feel comfortable going and talking to your pastor or your priest because you feel like you're going to be judged or they're going to judge your family. And so what I observed early on, and all these, I got lots of messages when I first put Blue Babies Pink out, was that parents were going it alone. And Kendra, as you know, the older you get in life, that's never a good idea. In any tough scenario of life, it is never a good idea to just draw inward and to deal with it yourself. And so what I'm trying to do is to pull back that veil and to create some community, because there are tons of parents out there who do have LGBT kids who've been down this road. I've got parents, in my group who their child came out 20 years ago and they're still, they're still figuring it out, but they're a heck of a lot healthier and more confident in their relationship than they were back then when they first had that conversation. So I started a program called Harbor. It's what I call very simply an online support program for Christian parents of LGBT kids. And what we keep our focus on is loving, supporting, and understanding our LGBT children. So I'm very clear to say, guys, I am not a parent. I am not here to give you parenting advice. But I am a gay man, and I do have experience living this life, and I have tons and tons of LGBT friends. And so, yeah, we keep our focus on how do we just lavishly love our kids? How do we seek to understand their world better, seek to understand their experiences better? So, yeah, we have a 3-hour workshop, sort of online video, and then we have a private Facebook group where that community happens. And really, that's where the magic is, because once parents realize, hey, I'm not alone, I don't have to be alone in this, everything changes for them. And you know as much as I do, Strong Family Alliance has similar programs and a similar level of support, which I love.
Well, it takes a village. I support what you do so much. And I especially love, we're coming at it from a mom's perspective, but I think you're the horse's mouth. It's like you're coming at it to say, this is what it's like. And I just think fostering understanding in a non-scary way, in a very supportive way, is just so important. So you opened a little can of worms there. So I'm going to just go on that one.
Open it up. I love it.
Let's open it up. Let's get it out there. I want to talk a little bit about faith. I told you offline that our organization started at a Methodist Women's Conference. I roomed together with Janet Duke, our founder, who is she's an angel on this earth, who has an LGBTQ child and adult now. And she just really felt like there weren't resources for her. She felt alone. And I think that's always a funny thing. If you ever do come out and say, well, I have a kid that's this or whatever, everybody does. I know it's a small percentage, but it is just so freeing to get it out there. And you do find out that there are so many others. And so that's one thing I love about what you do. But I know that one key issue for parents and for even LGBTQ people themselves is this faith issue and what they've always believed. And there are religious leaders that really believe in this singleness and celibacy thing. And for a long time, I know you avoided relationships for that reason. But I think, one thing that you said at one point was, you don't believe in a theology that institutionalized suffering for an entire class of people. Brett, whoa, BT, whoa. That is just, that's not the God I know,
Yeah,
and so
right.
would do that. And so I love that. So I want you to just talk for a minute. Again, we could have a whole series on this, but tell me about how your thoughts have evolved on this, because I think it's, from my experience, it's just is it the top thing, issue parents have, they grapple with, or one of the top for sure?
Yeah, so the language I use around this is traditional and affirming. And so when I say the word traditional, I mean people who hold a traditional understanding of a Christian sexual ethic versus affirming, which is what I consider myself to be. I affirm the belief that God can bless faithful, loving, monogamous, same-sex relationships. And so, again, we could talk for hours on this because I have lots and lots of thoughts. I have essentially spent the better part of my life researching this topic because it affects me so personally. And it's something I've always struggled to reconcile, is this faith and sexuality piece. And I'm also very clear to say, Kendra, that I don't judge people who hold that traditional viewpoint. My mom is one of them. My mom and I, to this day, do not agree on this issue. To her credit, she has come so far in learning to love me and learning to love my husband. She has shown us the love of Christ, even though technically she does not believe that God can bless a same-sex relationship. And so I don't have judgment for people who believe that. So I always qualify that, before I jump into some of these reasons of why I'm affirming. I just want people to know I'm not here casting stones, judging, and calling everyone who disagrees with me a terrible person, because I don't think that's true. So yeah, when I talk about being on this affirming side of things, I sort of have a list of, it's 11 reasons of why I fall kind of into that affirming camp. I can't get into those here, but I'll talk about 3 of them. The first reason that I think that traditional viewpoint is broken and is really bad is that it's cruel and destructive for LGBT people. And again, it's so simple in some ways, Kendra, for straight folks to empathize with this if they will engage their own empathy. And that, imagine you were a 15 years old LGBT person, and I said, all right, you're in the church, you're a part of this community, but no dating, no flirting, no marriage, no kids, and no family for the rest of your life. How demoralizing that would be. And that's essentially what is being mandated upon LGBT folks whenever this singleness and celibacy mandate is handed down. It's also destructive in that, we know scientifically through research, sociology, that prolonged forced singleness is bad for people. It's bad for their health. One study shows that chronic loneliness is as unhealthy as 15 cigarettes a day. You probably know that in the UK just this year, they have appointed a minister of loneliness because loneliness is such a scourge, particularly in their country, that they're having to address it as a health crisis. And so that's what I mean by destructive, expecting someone to deny their need for companionship. And again, Kendra, this is not about sex. It's often framed as, oh, well, you don't need sex to live, which I agree, but this is not about sex. This is really about a human primal need for companionship, intimacy, and sex certainly is a part of that. The second reason, again, is we are designed for companionship, and so we have to deny that if we're going to expect that of people, that they're supposed to just stay single and celibate forever. That is just not healthy, and that's not how we're designed. We are designed to partner up and to be in couples and form families. And then the third reason I do think this sort of traditional viewpoint, I think it's anti-family and it's anti-marriage. And again, if you're a person of faith, those are 2 things we value greatly, is marriage and family. And so it's just not good for people to be forced out of those things. All the good things in life come through marriage and family, right? The most valuable things in any of our lives is our family members. And so it's very, very important that we're allowed to have families, form marriage partnerships. Again, I've been married now for just a few months, but the level of flourishing and joy that it's brought me is really, really amazing. So.
Okay. Yes, I totally agree. That's great. I want to, I guess I would just want to ask you a question about, I know every story, I'm so happy for your story. I watched it on Instagram. I saw you tell it. It was so full of joy. I see exactly what you mean when you say joy and you look at those pictures. It's so evident. But I know every story isn't just wrapped up with a pretty bow. Is there anything that's still hard for you? Any other struggles that you still have?
I always start this, even with a question like this. I feel very blessed. I feel very grateful. I think, being a married gay person right now in human history in America is one of the best gigs around. We have come so far. There's so many ways we can engage. We can get married. We can engage with society. And not feel constantly judged. But of course, there are definitely things that we could improve on. We have a long way to go in certain areas. I do struggle with, the fact that my husband and we're still not welcome in most churches in America. Our family would not be welcomed or accepted or helped, even. And that I struggle with that because, LGBT same-sex couples have the same challenges that straight couples do, and we need support. We need the guidance from clergy and from churches and those support programs. I also struggle with, the myths that continue to float around about the LGBT community. One of the most persistent and horribly wrong ones is that gay people choose to be gay, which is, of course, is not true at all. No one would choose sort of this life, to be honest, because there are lots of negative health outcomes that are associated with being gay. And so all of us would have changed it early on, when we were younger. So yeah, we definitely did not choose this, but some people continue to believe that. Some people believe the myth that all gay people are very politically involved, we're out to steal the, religious freedom of people of faith. That is patently untrue as well. Most of us gay people are very average, boring people living very average, boring lives, and we're just wanting the same things that all of our straight friends want as well. And I think the last thing that I struggle with is, again, there is a level of demonization that still happens of the LGBT community, particularly if the latest, has been the trans issue and creating a lot of fear around trans people, which I just think is absurd as well. So, there are things we can improve on. There are things that are going really great. So there's definitely a level of nuance even in that conversation.
I think this is one reason I'm so glad you exist in this world, is because you represent a non-scary, here you are, here is the face, and I hope that I represent a Christian that is a non-scary, non-loud, I want to be a voice in the wilderness of Christian, acceptance and love and unconditional welcoming, and I think that this is I'm glad you exist in the world.
Yeah.
Real quick, I want to say that on our website, on strongfamilyalliance.org, I spent a lot of time researching organizations that were open and affirming for religious organizations. And I called them out to make sure I had the best ones. And I want people to go and find, there are religious organizations, there are churches. I know there aren't many, there aren't enough. And some of them I feel like straddle. They're not necessarily reconciling officially, but they really are welcoming. And I feel this list, finding a church is good. I actually, if you don't have one in your area, I listen to every sermon from my minister online too, So I think you can find religious support. Hopefully it's in your area, but if not, there are a lot of churches that, and I think it's growing. I work with a lot of organizations that are trying to do just what we're talking about, is increasing the welcoming affirmation in churches. So,
yeah.
So Brett, I just want to close with one final question. And I think this is sort of the crux of it for me. If you had one thing you could tell parents that are struggling, I would say go listen to your story. Can you tell just a little bit more though, I know the podcast and the bluebabiespink.com, but tell just a little bit more about what you would say to a parent that's struggling.
Here's a couple things I would say. My first recommendation is do your best to not make this about you. And this is hard because a lot of parents do experience pain when their child comes out. And when we're experiencing pain, we feel like a victim. And when we're a victim, the natural human response is to make it about us and to find healing and to fix that problem. And so I would just say as much as you can, put the focus on your child. Let them have that moment to tell their story, for you to ask maybe a few questions, for you to reaffirm and repeat your love for them over and over again. So again, try not to make it about you. I think the second thing is engage your own empathy towards your child's situation. Instead of jumping straight to maybe a religious position, theological conversation, spend some time putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about, gosh, what would it be like to be a young, insecure child growing up in potentially religious context with the feeling and expectation that your sexuality is going to ultimately send you to hell, and that you're expected, the only way to avoid that is to stay single and celibate for the rest of your life. So again, when you actually engage your own empathy with that, you can begin to identify better with your child. I think the next thing I would say, make peace with a situation that you cannot change. I think that's just good advice for everything in life is we can change things, some things, and some things we cannot change. And this is one of those things that you just can't change. And, pushing your child away, casting aspersions, making threats, which some parents do, is not going to change anything. The only thing it's really going to change is your relationship with your child in a negative way, and it's going to push them further. I always recommend to parents, love your kid lavishly so that you can preserve influence with them. When you're 70, 80, 90 years old, you want your child to still be coming to see you. You want your child to still engage with you and to listen to what you have to say. And your best shot with that, particularly if you're more on the traditional side of this conversation, is to, hold your beliefs if that's what you feel you need to do, but counterbalance that with an excessive, overwhelming amount of love, which is, I feel like, what my mom has done really, really well. And I have respect for her. Though we disagree on this issue, I have respect for her because she has gone out of her way to show love to me and my husband as well.
Love that. Something we say sometimes is, remember your child is the exact same person as the moment before they told you, the exact same person. And it's so weird how human nature makes us want to just change everything now. We never knew, we know all this is, just changes everything about who they ever were. And of course it doesn't, and I think that's really, really good advice. I also want to just mention, and I don't know how you feel about this. We didn't talk about this ahead, but, Adam Hamilton is big in the Methodist Church. And I'm Methodist, and he talks about, how, love the sinner, hate the sin. That doesn't really work for people, that's not really helpful to, and I think that's something that sometimes people say that they think they're straddling a little, but it's not really, necessarily the best plan of attack.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that phrase either. I have heard that been reworked to say, love the sinner, hate your own sin, instead of walking around hating.
I like it.
So that's my perspective is I'm going to worry about me. That's the only person I can control, and I'm not going to waste emotional energy, policing the behavior of others.
I love it, especially when it doesn't really affect, well, that's a whole other podcast as well about evangelical or judgment of things that don't necessarily affect them. Anyhow, that's a wrap. BT, I want to thank you so much for joining me. This is really personally just so great to talk to you. Also, I do believe it's so important for our mission at Strong Family Alliance to support parents, just to come out and talk about it, have a conversation, maybe hear some different things than you ever thought, If we do that, I'm just so grateful to the universe that put us together to get some of those things out. If you want to know more about Strong Family Alliance or National Parent Coming Out Day, which is the day after the important one, National Coming Out Day. National Parent Coming Out Day is Friday, the 11th? I should have had my calendar in front of me when I was
National Coming Out Day is the 11th, and Parents is the 12th. Yeah.
Yes. And really, it's not to out your child. It's just to show support in whatever way you're comfortable and your child is comfortable or your kid is comfortable with. I may have mentioned once or twice, I'd love for you to hear BT's story. It's on bluebabiespink.com. You can search Blue Babies Pink in your favorite podcast app and find the story there. You're going to want to start at the prologue. I always notice, don't you notice on podcasts, they always start at the latest. You're going to want to scroll to get down to the prologue. Start with episode 1 and keep going. If you need to shortcut it a little, you can go to episode 29. Let's see. I think that's about it. Brett, thank you. BT, thank you for joining me. I hope we change a few hearts and save a few lives today.
Thanks, Kendra. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one.
Cool. All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye.